Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am AA Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me in exploring ways we can create a more inclusive world together. You are important, you matter, and you can make a difference. Today, my guest is Jeannie Ewing. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate being here with you.
Absolutely. Why don't you just start us off by telling me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I could go in a lot of directions with that, but regarding inclusion, so I never really thought about this too much, this idea of inclusion, until my husband and I had our daughter, Sarah, who was born about 12 years ago with a complicated genetic condition called Abert syndrome. And it's a craniofacial diagnosis, so she looks different. I mean, anywhere we go, people know that she has a disability. And so I really started to try to enter into her world when she was a baby. And I really had to explore and investigate some of my own biases and the ways that I had operated in an ableist world that I just didn't know until then. And it was very eye-opening for me. And I guess since that time, I've just continued to learn and grow learn from her and learn from we have other kids who are also neurodivergent. Sarah is on the autism spectrum, and we have a couple other kids who are ADHD and OCD. So it's kind of like just understanding that the world is often not naturally adaptable to people who are different in some way, whether psychologically or neurologically or physiologically. And so it's helping me to kind of be more sensitive to language, behavior, and we kind of are trying to help our kids navigate what that looks like in our family, what that looks like for them individually, and things like that.
Yeah, thanks for the information. What is your definition of inclusion?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. So to me, it's about acknowledging the dignity of every human and welcoming them as a fellow pilgrim. So when I think of inclusion, I think of accompaniment. I don't think of like othering, where I'm not trying to condescend and offer help to someone who's different, but I really want to enter their world and understand what it's like to be them and walk hand in hand next to them. So to me, that's what it means. It has to do with belonging. It has to do with celebrating who every individual is, and so that they feel valued and seen and heard and understood.
Yeah, that's a great definition. Like growing up, did you have any exposure to people with disabilities?
I did, but not in my family. Okay. And, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so there wasn't a whole lot of, I don't know, information, education about any sort of disability, particularly if it's neurodivergence. And so the disability awareness wasn't kind of like on people's radar. Yeah. And when I think about it, there was a boy in high school who is on the autism spectrum, and he was like part of this other class, right? Like he wasn't mainstream, and that was very commonplace in the late 80s and to mid 90s. So I would see him in the lunchroom, and his name was Josh, and he would always wave and smile and say hi, and he knew my birthday, even though I told him one time. He knew every year and said happy birthday. And that was just kind of like dipping my toes in the water, because I did not grow up in a neighborhood or really a culture where we talked about people with disabilities. So it was more like they were kind of on the fringes of the mainstream or ableist culture that I was raised in.
Yeah. So I was born in the mid to late 70s, and I honestly don't remember even hearing the word disability or anything at all before my daughter was born, and she's 22. So I just, once she was born, had the epilepsy diagnosis, that whole world opened up to me, just had to learn all of it. So I like asking that question, because like I said, I don't remember if I'm sure there had to have been kids in school that were in special ed or, different classes. I just we either didn't talk about it, or I've just completely forgotten, that it was even there. So it's interesting.
Yeah, so that reminds me that you said that. I had a conversation with an older woman, so she's probably in my parents' generation, a baby boomer. And I remember her talking to me about when her son Andy was born in the 70s. Andy was born with a craniofacial diagnosis that's very similar to Sarah's. It's
Hmm.
under the same kind of umbrella. And she told me about his birth story and how, I don't know, it was probably like 1975 or something like that. How, as soon as he was born, the postpartum nurses whisked him away, and all of the medical staff advised her instantly to institutionalize him. She was not allowed to see him. She hadn't held him yet. And she said she really had to learn how to advocate for her own child right away because there was this, maternal instinct that she had. She loved her son. She wanted him to have the best life that she could give him. And so I've heard stories of how hard it was, I think, for some of these pioneers
Right.
in disability awareness and acceptance who really had to like pave the way and blaze that trail
Right.
for other people, other advocates that are parents and other caregivers, because there really wasn't a lot of support and there weren't a lot of resources that
Yep.
they had access to. So it's really beautiful and inspiring to me to hear these stories from older generations and recognizing how they really kind of handed on, passed down this legacy. Now I'm picking up this torch as
Right.
a mom in this era where I do have access to a lot of resources.
Yep.
We are having these open conversations and there is a lot more acceptance. I think we have a long way to go. But, each one of us, you and me and all of your listeners and all of your other interviewees, we have this little piece of the puzzle where we can bring awareness and education and acceptance in our own communities.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I like this platform and others where we can share our stories and people can, realize they're not alone. There are other people out there going through stuff. That's the big thing for me is just sharing stories so, somebody can find out, hey, my daughter also has the same diagnosis as yours. And, we're not the only person going through it. And, that's a big thing.
Right.
Can you talk maybe a little bit about? I looked on your website. You do speaking and books and stuff. Do you want to talk about like your books and how you got into that and what you write about and stuff?
So traditionally, I wrote about grief,
Okay.
and I got into publicly writing about that based on Sarah's birth story and all of the psychological and emotional and spiritual wrestling and grappling I had to do. And I didn't really have a companion for that. So I kind of wrote the book that I needed.
Mhm.
And that was From Grief to Grace. And from that point on, I was just invited to speak nationally to different groups of people who were mourning the loss of a loved one, workshops, conferences,
Mhm.
retreats. And one of the things I really aimed to do and still do, even though I've stepped away from grief work, is to redefine what grieving means, because a lot of people pigeonhole it into a literal death of a person, and we all experience these metaphorical deaths all the time of losing a dream, losing part of our identity. um, I think that those were the aspects of death and grieving that kind of brought me to the work that I was doing. And when I kind of explained to other people, you might be grieving on many different levels.
Right.
What brought you to this conference or this workshop or retreat might have been that you lost your husband or your child or your best friend or your parent. But really, there are other things you're mourning also that maybe you just didn't know was part of grieving.
Right.
So I was trying to really reconstruct this idea that we have societally of what grief is. And a lot of it's also based on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, which I think have been largely misinterpreted. So Kubler-Ross and her team, they did decades of research on terminally ill patients. And that's how they came up with these 5 stages. And yet, when most people maybe peripherally or nominally hear about them, they assume that it's like, this is how grieving goes. It's this chronological, linear
Right.
process. And I'm supposed to get to number 5, which is acceptance. The
Yeah.
reality is that grief is very spiral, and it comes in waves, it comes in bursts. And I think there are lots of different grief groups that are very successful at communicating that in metaphorical language, and doing kind of coaching and kind of guiding people through their grief. But those are 2 main things that I really wanted to kind of teach and impart to people, because I noticed that it's still a very common misconception to think, oh, if someone hasn't died and I haven't gone through these 5 stages, then it must not be grief. So I wanted people to understand there's this whole constellation of experiences that happen when we experience any kind of devastating loss, and that we go through lots of paradoxes, and we can learn how to hold that tension of the both and learn how to just sit in the middle of some of those mysterious, undefinable, unnameable feelings or thoughts or experiences, and allow them to just kind of metabolize. So that was kind of the work that I was doing. And then I pivoted to writing about my memoir on motherhood and identity.
Wow. Sounds like you're busy.
Yeah, with 5 kids too. So yes.
Kids too, yeah. So it sounds like, did you grow up going to church?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I grew up Baptist, so a lot of, I mean, like conservative, couldn't drink and play cards, movies, all that stuff. And heard all, I went every time the doors open, so I have all that background growing up. And then CC is born, and you have like the, different verses pop in your head, the ones where everybody's going to have a perfect body up in heaven and stuff. And then my brain's like, well, she was created in God's image here, or supposedly here. And like, how does that, match up with them saying, hearing that she's going to have a perfect body? Is like, she's not perfect now. So you get these little things where you're like, her being born causes me to look into stuff and think differently. Did you have any similar things like that, where you had maybe heard stuff growing up in the church, and then your child is born and you have to kind of look deeper or rethink things?
Aaron, I think you and I could have a whole conversation about that, like a whole separate. There's a deep dive. That's a deep dive into the narratives that religious communities really impart and embed in the people who grow up in institutional churches. So yes, that's my short answer. Yes. So when Sarah was born, I really had to grapple with the messages I had been spoon-fed through my religious upbringing that no longer fit. And I had to accept that the containers in which I was born, our family just didn't apply. We just couldn't fit into those boxes. And so it's really hard for me to reconcile the presentation of a particular religious belief or doctrine versus what it means to me. And what I mean by that is, I think a lot of times big religious institutions have these platitudes, and they like to have this sunny spirituality where they can fix everything with the Bible or with whatever their version of God is. And the truth is that people are complicated and relationships are nuanced, and life is never lived in this straightforward manner. And so to have really rigid ideas about life and death and redemption and hope and all of these spiritual concepts are troublesome to me, not because I don't believe, but because I think that faith is bigger than what we've boxed it into with a lot of our religious structures. And I think our religious institutions are important. I think religion is valuable and has a lot to offer society at large, but I also have seen ways that it has very deeply harmed people and even traumatized them and pushed them away. So I tried to be sensitive to that, because I think that most of us, at least the conversations I have with other people, in these circles have a complicated relationship with religion.
Yeah.
And I think that it's valid for us to honor those experiences, to talk about them openly, and to be able to say, you know what, my version of God and my version of faith has maybe changed over time. And for each of us to be able to hold that and accept it and to integrate it into the path of growth that we're on right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of figured. And so CC is a wheelchair, so I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, I recently, in the last year, probably found out that churches were one of the groups that was fighting against the ADA because they didn't want to have to do all the work to make them accessible, and then you kind of realize where, families with children with disabilities are kind of, they're not. You see where they're not always accepted or feel at home in churches, and to me, it's very sad growing up in the church. So there's just a lot of interesting feelings and emotions for me, I guess, around the church stuff. And my CC loves going to church. Well, she went a lot. We went a lot more when she was younger, but she loves going to church, worshiping, and she's. I mean, I would sit there and watch her sing the songs, and it's just so pure. Like, she doesn't care what people think of how she sings. She just is just singing to Jesus, and I love that. So I mean, there's that piece. It's just the other stuff that kind of, for me, gets in the way.
I love that. And I'm thinking about this whole concept of inclusion as it pertains to worship, because what my spiritual director told me, it's not enough for us to say we believe in Jesus. We have to believe Jesus. And she explained that. She said many Christians, they can rehearse and repeat and parrot Bible verses off the top of their head. They know the right thing to say. But are they really walking on the margins of society? Are they really walking with the people in the wheelchairs? Are they finding the people on the streets? Do they know them? Do they love them? That's what Jesus did. It's so obvious. His best friends were these pariahs and outcasts and of all varieties, wealthy and poor, blind, disabled, tax collectors and Pharisees. And it's like, if we don't learn how to celebrate, again, I want to go back to that word, celebrate all people, we are really doing a huge disservice, because we're not living out what it means to be a person who loves God and who reflects God. And so it really warms my heart when you talk about Cece and how she loves to sing and doesn't matter what people think, and she doesn't care, because that's very much how my Sarah is. Yeah. Sarah likes to do videos with me on Substack, and she has quite a fan club. And one of the things she often says is, I know that I have God on my side. And a lot of the people who follow my Substack aren't necessarily religious people. I don't know where they are or what they believe, and it doesn't matter to me. I don't care. But it's really interesting how Sarah's very pure faith, like you were talking about, Cece, has a pure faith, it's this light, it's this beacon. And we live in such a hopeless, dismal, divisive world. I see it on the faces of people everywhere, just going out of my house, and it's like you were saying, it's really disheartening. It's really sad. But then when I look at this strange paradox of here are children who have these conditions that society thinks makes them kind of less than or inferior, or maybe they're helpless in some way, and yet they're the ones who have a much wiser worldview than most of us do. And so I'm constantly being humbled by what all of my children teach me. And it brings me back to what it means to be compassionate, and what it means to be childlike and to marvel at the world around me. And there's just something really beautiful about opening your heart to whatever the invitation of the moment is. And I think that's also what's kind of informed this whole definition for me of inclusion, which really to me boils down to belonging. And every human being wants to belong. We all want to be welcomed. We all want to say, hey, you have a seat at the table. Everyone here is part of this conversation. There's no one who's excluded. There's no one who's standing off to the side. No one is serving. No, we're all together in this. And I think that that's just a really important um, I want to say mission that I feel that I have in my own life with whatever I'm doing, whether I'm writing or speaking, it doesn't matter to me, or just being in the world, being in relationship. I want every person to know that they're welcome.
That's great. Love that. Can you explain? I mean, I've heard of Substack. Can you explain like a little bit more what it is and how people can find you on there and stuff like that?
Sure. Sure. So Substack is a great community. It's an online platform for creative people, mostly writers, but there are other people who are all sorts of artists, like painters, photographers, there are musicians, some are multimedia artists. And basically it's kind of like an amalgamation of all the different social platforms we think of: Facebook, Instagram, X, LinkedIn, and it's all kind of like meshed into one place. So Substack has the option of simply posting weekly essays or articles to your email subscribers.
Okay.
But then it has this whole other realm that you can participate in, and that you can do live videos, you can do podcasts, you can also post on their social arm, which is called Notes, and that kind of functions like updates or inspirational quotes and lifestyle, personal growth messages, inspirational notes, things like that. I would say, though, the feel overall, the culture overall at Substack is far more positive and sensitive, compassionate than my experience on many of the other big social platforms. So there are people everywhere that are going to kind of taint that experience. But overall, I have just found a whole world, truly. Like, I have connected with people all over the world who just have these brilliant minds and these generous hearts. And I've made friends with people. We've collaborated. It's just a really beautiful way to use the digital spaces that we have.
Yeah, that's great. What about you? Have you always been included?
Oh, heavens no. I mean, I grew up the oldest of two, and I was always really shy, very studious, and sensitive. And again, growing up in the 80s and 90s, that was not necessarily something that was celebrated and honored.
Yeah.
And often I was told, stop crying, you're being too sensitive, you're taking this, too seriously, you're taking this the wrong way, why can't you lighten up? And, of course, in middle age now, I can say, yeah, I needed some more balance in my life. But to feel less than or shamed because of my inherent personality
Mm-hmm.
was very damaging. And I always kind of felt like the outsider, kind of like watching everything and watching other groups and feeling like I wanted to belong, but never really finding my home. So in a way, I've kind of always felt like I was a wayfarer, and I was just kind of wandering and trying to find my way. But, as I've gotten older and I've been able to appreciate who I am and embrace who I am, it's really helped me to give myself what I didn't receive from others when I was young. And that's been very healing for me. So I can be with people who are very different, and I can be in groups of people where I may or may not click with everything about them. And I can still feel at peace and content with who I am, and still feel like maybe there's a sliver of who I am that belongs.
That's awesome. How can we use empathy to be more inclusive?
Well, I think empathy is actually a skill that we have to learn. And in my experience, I used to be a high school counselor, so I'm kind of speaking from that lens. Um, it's a skill that really needs to be developed young. And it doesn't mean that when we're older, we can't learn it. But I think that it's very, very vital that we instill this in our children. So to me, empathy is a very deep, mature ability to step into another person's worldview and their life and feel for them. It doesn't mean that you pity them, because that has to do with condescension, and that's that othering that I was talking about, the me versus them, the inferior versus superior. But really, again, accompaniment, walking alongside them. And how do we do that? Well, I think that first and foremost, when someone comes to us as they are, it's important for me to be aware of my own emotional triggers and activation, and to just kind of note them in my mind, and then make a plan to return to that later. And then as I kind of psychologically set that aside, to really be present with this person, which to me means I'm kind of removing the filters that I tend to have, whether it's kind of this arming up, or so like a defensive stance, or maybe something more like keeping someone at a distance because it doesn't feel safe. I'm really trying to set those things aside and enter into this experience in this moment with this person. And so empathy is really about love. I think it's about touching my heart, touching someone else's heart. And like I said, it is a skill that can be learned and needs to be learned. So what I mean by that is, with our children, when they have experiences at school or in the community that are unkind, so I'm going to use that word, kind and unkind, my husband and I will take those situations and use them as springboards for teaching opportunities, teaching moments.
Yep.
And so a lot of times we'll have these conversations like, okay, Sarah, somebody called you a monster at the playground and then started laughing. How did that feel for you? What was that like for you? And then our whole family like holds space for that. So Sarah will, of course, often tear up. She asks for a hug. She says, "Why am I ugly?" We have to really deal with some painful and difficult human emotions and experiences. But then, my other children are witnessing that.
Right.
And after we're able to give Sarah the comfort she's asking for, then we talk about it. I turn the narrative around and I say, okay, what can you do if you see this happening to someone else?
Mm-hmm.
How can you respond in a way? Or what if this happens to you? How can we be kind? So kindness is another value that we have in our family that's part of inclusion and belonging. And I think the conversation surrounding empathy is, again, one that could be a whole other episode, because it's really hard to define and it's really hard to illustrate. But all in all, I think that it really comes down to, how do I love? How do I respond in love to this moment and this person in this moment? And then if I do feel hurt, or maybe I'm angry right now, or something this person says or does is activating like a restlessness or an agitation in me, then, part of growing in empathy and being present to others is going back separately later and investigating that. What I do is I do process journaling. I also have a spiritual director. I have a therapist. There's lots of different modalities that we can use in order to understand ourselves better. And then that way, when we show up the next time in our relationships, we can be more fully engaged in loving that person, accompanying them, being just a loving presence and a kind person.
Yeah, that's great. So you've used the term spiritual director, I think, a couple times now. Can you explain what a spiritual director is?
She could probably do that better than I can, but to me, a spiritual director is just somebody who is in relationship with me, and they have a very deep and mature spiritual lens. So my spiritual director and I have worked together for about 10 years. And the way that our relationship is, it's very open and very fluid. And so it's not bound by doctrines and tenets and any kind of rules or anything, or specific parameters surrounding religion. It's more of a, where am I spiritually, and what does my how is my faith taking shape right now? Because there was a point in time when I was pregnant with our 5th child, and it was right before COVID hit. And I remember feeling very desolate and dark. And I told my spiritual director, I feel like I'm losing my faith. I feel like I hate God. And she said, good, you're outgrowing your faith. You're like a snake shedding its skin. Your faith is, the faith that you had before was too small. Now you're growing into something bigger. So that's what I mean when I say spiritual direction. It's more of a person who has a spiritual outlook and lens, and they just are kind of a facilitator and a guide. It's kind of like a therapist, but they don't have a psychological background. They have a spiritual background.
Okay.
So my spiritual director has some sort of master's degree in, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's in theology or some sort of spiritual pathway, but she's working with me in my spiritual growth.
How do you find a spiritual director?
Good question. I think I found her because she was giving a talk at my old parish, the old place that Ben and I went to church. And the way that she spoke about what she calls gospel vulnerability just so deeply resonated with me. The language she used, the radical way that she was kind of inviting and challenging us to step into the unknown, to step into the margins and be with people who maybe made us uncomfortable. It was an invitation. So I found out afterwards when I was talking to her at her book table, that she also offered spiritual direction. And that was what started it. As far as in general, I don't know if there's like a directory online. I'm not really sure how somebody would find a spiritual director specifically, but I do know that they are out there.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard the term, so you used it twice. And I was like, I mean, I kind of roughly figured it out, but I thank you for the clarification. What is one tip you can share to help the listeners to be more inclusive today? So just something anybody can start doing today to be more inclusive.
When you go in the world, be kind. Choose to be kind. What I mean by that is show up as you are with a good heart. Whoever you encounter, choose to smile. Open the door for somebody. Let someone go ahead of you in line at the grocery store. Say something genuine and positive and complimentary about a person. And these are all very spontaneous things, and they don't take a lot. But I think each of us can bring a little bit more softness in the world just by the way we show up, by the way we choose to show up.
That was great. Do you want to maybe share how everybody can connect with you?
Sure. Well, I'm really active on Substack, and I already explained kind of what Substack's like and what it is. So people can go there and find me under my name, Jeannie Ewing, or they can find me under the title of my Substack, which is I Grow Strong Again.
Okay. Awesome. Ready for the last question?
Yeah.
Do you like Spam lunch meat, yes or no?
No, my husband does, though.
That was quick. So yeah, I live in Austin, Minnesota, where they make Spam and where the Spam Museum is located. So I've been asking everybody just to see if they like it or not. So that's kind of my surprise question at the end.
That's hilarious because my husband Ben loves Spam.
Okay.
And we've had this debate probably for almost 20 years.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah, so if you ever want to visit the Spam Museum, you got to come to Austin, Minnesota. So.
Okay. Sounds good.
It's pretty fun. Kids, I mean, they have a lot of history stuff. They have stuff for kids. You get a spample where it's like they walk around with a tray with little chunks of Spam.
A spample?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they get into it.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you for hosting, Aaron. You were a very gracious host. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
To those listening, thank you for allowing me to be part of your journey. It is truly an honor. Please join the podcast newsletter by clicking on the link in the episode description to keep up with the latest episodes. Together, we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.